Hello and welcome to another edition of the RealTime Fantasy Sports Show. I'm Jeff Paur, senior writer for RealTime Fantasy Sports. And on today's show, I'm going to give you my 5 fantasy takeaways from week 4 of the fantasy football season. I know there are still 2 games to be played, but the good news is it looks like the Chiefs-Patriots game is going to take place. There's been no more positive tests as of now. So that means that game is a go. And then we have the Falcons-Packers as well, which should be a good game. But here are my 5 fantasy takeaways before those games take place. First of all, my first takeaway, big takeaway, have contingency plans in place for your roster. This year is different than any other, and there was a chance that Chiefs Patriots game was not going to take place, and that likely would have impacted a lot of fantasy teams because waiver wires had run and had been finished for the week for a lot of leagues. So that means you could not have back contingency plan in place if you had like the Chiefs kicker or the Chiefs defense or even Travis Kelce and you don't have a backup. So if that happened, if the Chiefs game was canceled and you had Butker and no backup, you were out 7, 8, or 9 points this week, which likely could have been a difference in your game. So for me, going forward, this is something I would not do in the past, but I'm having backups in place at nearly every position on my roster in case something like this happens again, a late positive test that would throw a game into flux and maybe get canceled. So I think it's just too important to have points missing from your team. So especially with someone like Travis Kelce, a lot of teams who have Kelce don't have a backup on the roster, backup tight end, because Kelsey's a stud. They're just going to find a tight end for the 1 week they need him. Don't have anybody on the roster to replace him at the moment. But I'm not doing that anymore, especially going forward for the rest of this season, because a COVID positive test could cancel a game at any minute, especially late in the week, like on a Saturday, if a team tests positive and you're going to be searching for players and your waiver wire, or you might not be able to add drop, will be closed, and then you're in trouble. So this is something different I would never do in the past, but for me, I'm looking at adding backups at all my positions, including kicker and defense, so I'm not missing out on any points. So that's just my PSA public service announcement for all you fantasy owners out there this year. This year's different. So I would really consider doing that on all my rosters, especially if you're in big money leagues or one of these big time contests like the fantasy championship on our site with the chance to win a lot of money, and every point counts in that contest. All right, my number 2 takeaway from week 4, avoid Ravens running backs. So I just don't feel comfortable using any of these Ravens running backs right now. They had a good matchup this week against Washington. I thought they could get up big, run the ball more in the second half. That actually did happen a little bit. They went to their backup quarterback, Robert Griffin, got some playing time. But even with that happening, it still was a mess at running back. Gus Edwards led the team in carries, 9 carries for 38 yards. Mark Ingram ran 8 times for 34 yards, scored a touchdown. So that was a positive. But even with that score, he wasn't much help to fantasy teams because he had just 34 yards. And then J.K. Dobbins ran 5 times for 16 yards. So just a mess. These 3 guys all split work. Nobody's getting double-digit touches right now. I just don't want any part of it. Edwards actually leads the team in rushing after 4 weeks with 167 yards, but he doesn't have a touchdown. So he's been little help for fantasy teams because he hasn't been finding the end zone and doesn't catch many passes. So for me, Baltimore running backs, I don't want any part of them right now. All right, my number 3 takeaway of week 4 of the fantasy football season is that it was the week of the unknown receivers scoring touchdowns. So normally this happens every week. You get a guy that scores a touchdown you never heard of, kind of comes out of nowhere, gets a touchdown pass. But for this week, we had 4 players fit the bill. For this one, really was a surprise. So leading off was Travis Fulgham with Philadelphia. He's had 2 catches for 57 yards and a 42-yard touchdown, which was the game-winning score for Philadelphia. Again, Fulgham had done nothing all year before this game, so that was a big surprise. And then in Buffalo, Gabriel Davis, he had 1 catch. It was a 26-yard touchdown. Again, we didn't see this one coming. Davis had done nothing for Buffalo all season long with Stephon Diggs and John Brown leading the weight receiver for them, and Cole Beasley as well. And then the Chargers actually had 2 receivers do this. Jalen Guyton had a 72-yard touchdown. That was his only catch. Tyron Johnson, 53-yard touchdown. That was his only catch. And then to make matters worse, the Chargers had a tight end do this. Donald Parham, he had a 19-yard score. That was his only catch. And again, he had done nothing all year. This happens every week, but it made for kind of an interesting week for fantasy teams because These were kind of wasted touchdowns, weren't a help to any fantasy rosters. So it made for some low scoring games. I know there were some big fantasy performances like Joe Mixon and Dak Prescott, who had big games once again. But for the most part, scores were down a little bit this week. It was a little bit of a boomer bust week for fantasy teams. My number 4 takeaway: don't give up on players after 3 games, especially superstars. Joe Mixon showed that this week. He came up huge. He had a 3 touchdown game, 181 total yards, finally came through, had a lot of work. This Bengals offense is looking much better than it has in recent years with Joe Burrow as their QB. And Burrow's really loosening defenses a little bit because he's throwing the ball well, which I think is good news for Mixon going forward. I think he really could be a big fantasy contributor the rest of the way, despite his slow start to start the season. Odell Beckham, another player, had a monster game. He had done next to nothing his first 3 games, but he had 3 total touchdowns, 154 total yards, 5 catches. He got some work running the ball, had a big 70-plus yard rushing touchdown, also had a lot of catches, though, 5 catches. So don't give up on superstars after 3 games. They tend to, come through at some point during the year. So I just kind of sometimes you have to be patient with these guys. And Mixon and Beckham were 2 players that stood out this week who had done nothing early in the season. All right, my last fantasy takeaway from week 4. I just talked about not giving up on superstars after 3 games, but for me, it's time to bench Kenyan Drake. So he's not really in that superstar category. I thought maybe he might be a superstar this year with his finish to last year in Arizona, playing a great defense, but he's done next to nothing this year. I thought this was the week for him to come through, played a bad Panthers rush defense. He's been getting a lot of touches, but it was more the same. Ran 13 times for just 35 yards. And most disturbing for me was Drake didn't catch a pass in this game. He has just 1 score all year, and then his lack of the work in the passing game again has been a huge detriment to his fantasy value. He has just 5 catches for 20 yards on the season after 4 games. That's not helping fantasy teams. So for me, I think it's time to bench Kenyan Drake until he gets going for Arizona. All right, those are my 5 fantasy takeaways for week 4. Hopefully, you came out on the winning end in all of your games. And if you need players to come through tonight in those games tonight, hopefully they come through for you and it helps lead you to a fantasy victory. This has been Jeff Paur for RealTime Fantasy Sports. Have a great day, everyone.